And I would like to introduce then to you a gentleman who is familiar to many of you and to many of us. The Reverend Dr. David Pfrimmer is Principal Dean of Waterloo Lutheran Seminary at Wilfrid Laurier University and a Professor of Applied Christian Ethics. He has served many years in the church and has served previously to that position for over 20 years as the Director of the Lutheran Office for Public Policy, and brings that expertise here again this evening. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pfrimmer. Sure.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give you a handout, so hopefully that'll expedite my comments as well, although I was quite taken with the fellows on the panel here. There's quite a lot for us to all ponder. I will kind of build on the two previous presentations. I want to make clear the kind of argument I'm making that the proposed charter, in its longer version, I won't go the whole title, is not, I believe, in the public interest, and coming out of a Lutheran theological frame, make a bit of a case for why I believe that to be the case. My argument, which is laid out for you, is somewhat straightforward. First of all, I think we should welcome the occasion that this charter presents, if not the issue itself. There has been a real reluctance in the Canadian scene to talk about the role of faith in public life. And in fact, there's been an aversion by it. You will not find a politician in this country, except of the recent crop and variety in Ottawa, or Rob Ford, as the case may be, but some peril of his own political future, using the term God bless Canada or God bless you. This is not invoked in political speeches in Canada, and for a very clear reason. Public faith is kept out of the public in many respects, or sought to by some in the kind of chattering and leadership classes. So this occasion, I think, is an important moment, as you rightly pointed out, and one that also has some ominous qualities to it. The thing I would also point out that we have to understand is faith in the world today is more public than it has ever been anywhere. We used to talk about American exceptionalism, that is to say, the United States has this sort of civil religion, and they have this kind of religious quality to much of their public life, and that they're unusual because as societies become more secular and more educated and more affluent, religion gets more relegated to the private sphere and becomes less important. Well, in point of fact, that's not the case. And the evidence, many who have advocated what's known as the secularization thesis have been proven to be wrong. And even prominent sociologists like Peter Berger, who are leading advocates of this, have now said there's the desecularization thesis, really, and that in fact the America is not the exception. It's places like Canada and Europe that are the exception. So this is something to bear in mind. I think we also need to, my second point in the argument would be this, that faith shapes both private and public identities of people. It makes us who we are. We cannot disaggregate our faith and leave it sort of somewhere else and expect our identity to remain intact. We are of a package, of one piece. For 10 years I was on the committee that oversaw chaplaincy in the province of Ontario. By the way, I'm not a chaplain. I have some training, but I'm not a chaplain. But my job was around the policies that governed the provision of spiritual care to people who were in the custody or in the care of the government. And in fact, many of the non-Christian faith groups made it very clear that their identity, their multiculturalism, was caught up in their multi-faith identity, and you can't just sort of separate them in some bifurcated way. And by the way, the statement that was handed out to you from the Canadian Interfaith Conversation makes this abundantly clear. It's not for governments to determine identity, and they can't arbitrarily fix it. So even if you'd like it, if you don't like this idea that faith and identity and culture are all of a piece, it's not for governments to alter that. That's the way it is. The other thing I would say is today, people comprise, when we speak about public life, public life is much more polyphonic in a way, or multifaceted today. People are part of not just one public, they're part of many publics. And what I use, and you'll see in the graphic I have here, these many publics taken as together form what I believe is what is called the public commons. And the public commons is where we work out our national purpose, where, as Jared was talking about, how it is we serve our neighbor in terms of the common good that is generated around that. And there are multiple groups that contribute to that. If you look briefly at that, it involves economic actors, not just business. We seem to think the economy is run only by business these days. We're all economic actors. It includes labor movement and a whole host of other people. It involves government, yes. It also involves civil society, probably the most significant contributor to the public commons these days, the voluntary sector. And it involves faith groups. And we all are actors in shaping this public purpose, the common good that's generated there. And we need to understand that the public is not just government, and it's not just a very narrow band of activity. The binary kind of logic that says there's a public and a private really doesn't apply anymore today. Even I appreciated what you said about Luther's two kingdoms, but even at a shallow reading of that, for those who don't understand what Luther intended, that kind of binary logic doesn't even apply that in that way today. So we need to understand that the public commons involves multiple publics. And now let me explain what I mean by public, because church people usually get this wrong in many respects. We have publics, and the problem is we don't think of them this way. Publics are voluntary associations of individuals gathered around an idea, which in fact transforms them in the process as they address it and deal with it. And so in some sense, we need to understand the role that the public and these publics play, these important ideas that transform and change us as well. Faith communities themselves constitute a public in that kind of definition, don't we? We're gathered around some very important ideas. Ideas, I might suggest, that are of ultimate importance, ultimate meaning to people, and are significant in this regard. So the task here that I would argue in terms of the public interest, the political task of faith groups, along with these other groups, right, is not to allow one sector to dominate the public commons. If it does, you end up with a tyranny of a various sort. If it's the faith communities that dominate, you end up with a theocratic state, which is inappropriate. If it's the state that dominates, you end up with a kind of totalitarianism, a tyranny of a sort, which is not appropriate. If, as you have today, the economic sector, and particularly business, dominating the public commons, you are what you buy, you know this, right? There's another form of domination here that's inappropriate. Now, people say, when I do this, they always say, well, you're always so hard on business, or you're anti-business. No, and that's not it. We need to push back on these people when they seek to dominate. Why? So that they can do what God has called them to do, as Jared was talking about in terms of the God's presence in the world. So one of the things I think that's important is safeguarding the balance within the public commons is important. Now, you can read some of the other things here, and I'll kind of go through them somewhat quickly. But the problem with the idea of this charter is that it preferences the role of the state. And my concern particularly is that in maintaining this balance within the public commons, the state cannot command the ultimate loyalty of its citizens. This is why freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, your point, I think, John, and to some extent, is very, very crucial here. Because people have to have loyalties that transcend the loyalty to the state. And that's not just to be subversive of the state. That's so that the state can be authentically what it needs to be. the arbiter of good order and governance for the well-being of its citizens. And the right to dissent is absolutely crucial. That's the one extreme of this freedom of conscience, because it in fact animates the way democracy and participation work. Citizens have to say and be able to say to the state, we beg to differ. We do not agree. So those of you who went out to the demonstration were doing your civic duty, not just that you were opposing a government policy, but you were doing what I think is necessary for citizens to do, that is to dissent. And this culture of dissent is what gives our democracy some vitality. I think the point's been made. The world's no longer binary, but polyphonic. People of multiple sectors. So you're not just a faith group member. You're an economic actor too. So it's more complicated. You don't want to be too rigid about the application of this little graphic. One of the other things that I would say is absolutely crucial to bear in mind is the notion of laicité, which is, I think, it comes out of the French experience. But it is important that the state maintain some neutrality. That's not to say it can impose its identity on the individuals. This is the problem here. But in fact, the state does need to maintain neutrality in order to allow religious minorities to have their rights safeguarded. And one of the things this charter does is, in fact, it preferences a particular, what I would argue is a religious view, a secularist religious view. But if you don't like that, it at least preferences an ideological view, which is probably inappropriate and again reflects the state's will to power. By the way, states tend to try and domesticate all forms of opposition. They don't like groups that or people that have loyalties that transcend their loyalty to the state. My last couple of points here are pretty simple. One is transparency and full disclosure. Better to have people wearing a turban or wearing a religious symbol so I know where you're coming from, so that if you do in fact act in an inappropriate way, I have justifiable grounds to file a complaint and appeal to the state to arbitrate what I think has been a prejudicial action on your part. And this is, I think, is important. To not be able to see, note where people's perspective is often to people who can hide behind this sort of veil of anonymity, a false anonymity, I might add, that creates problems. Well, my conclusions, you can read them there. First of all, a secularist worldview. And when I say secularist, by that I mean this is an active imposition of secularism on a society. This is what we see in places like Turkey, for example, which have a secularist agenda. And it's not just secularism, which is a kind of sometimes seen as a passive thing that evolves, right, through education. So, and the danger here is that a secular charter that's being proposed, or the charters, can easily preference a particular orientation to the exclusion of all others, and thereby work against the very values which it claims to be upholding and defending. Thank you.